once we get that going.
Then I will hit, where is the record?
Let's do test. Let's see. Commissioner Hanson, can you hear me okay? Commissioner Hanson, can you hear me okay? Oh, we better turn that one off. Okay, use that one. Cliff, can you hear me okay, Cliff?
Yes, I can.
Thank you. All right,
I'm gonna start recording.
okay. Good evening, the July 14th, 2022 Whatcom County Planning Commission meeting is called to order. I'll call the roll. Please let me know if you're here. We do have some of the Planning Commission members here. So Robert Bartel. Robert Bartel. Kelvin Barton, that's me. I am here. Atul Deshmani. Atul Deshmani. Jim Hansen.
Here.
Stephen Jackson. Stephen Jackson. Julie Jefferson.
Here.
Kimberly Lund.
Here.
Dominic Masseri.
Here.
And Scott Van Dalen.
Here.
Okay. Right. Please join me for the flag salute. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, it's time for department update, and would Assistant Planning Director Steve Roberge, would you give us some update?
You bet. So tonight we're going to talk about watershed amendments. We're back to this. And in our next meeting, we're going to talk about, we're back to talking about the wireless. And then after that, August, we will probably take August off. Come back and talk about buildable lands.
All right. Anything else? Right, thank you. So now is the time for open session for public comment. Tammy, looks like we have one attendee. Would you take over, please?
Certainly. Okay, welcome to the meeting. This meeting is being broadcast live. The audio is being recorded and will be posted to the county website. As noted on our website, members of the public may watch the meeting or join online by phone. During the public comment session, speakers may not speak to items that are scheduled on the agenda for a public hearing tonight, but there is no public hearing tonight, so everything's on the table. Let's see, we have no public present at this time, but we do have the one attendee. If you would like to speak to anything in the public comment, please raise your hand. If you are on a mobile device, go ahead and press the hand icon. And if you're on the phone, you would press *9 to raise your hand. Okay.
Okay,
Hands are raised.
thank you, Tammy. So it is time now for commissioner comments. Are there any commissioners that would like to speak? Commissioner Masseri.
Yeah, I'd just like to say I email corresponded with Alex from Resources and Michael from Million Trees.
And Commissioner Hanson.
Yeah, I'll have to say I corresponded with those same two people about the overlay.
Thank you. Any other commissioners wish to speak? Okay, let's move on to approval of minutes for the June 23rd meeting.
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes.
We have a motion to approve. Do we have a second?
I can second it.
Okay. Are there any corrections or additions? Okay, hearing no corrections or additions to the minutes, Tammy, would you call the roll, please?
Okay, Commissioner Masseri.
Abstain.
Let's see, Commissioner Van Dalen
Yes.
and Commissioner Hanson,
Yes,
Commissioner Jefferson,
yes,
Commissioner Lund,
Yes,
Commissioner Barton.
Yes.
Okay, that is 5 yeses, that carries.
All right. So we are now to unfinished business. That's a continuation of our work session on the Lake Whatcom watershed overlay. And staff Cliff Strong is going to lead us in that. Cliff, go ahead.
Thank you. Good evening, commissioners. At your last meeting, you asked staff to work with the folks from Resources and Whatcom Million Tree Project to come up with language we agreed upon regarding the 3 outstanding issues, given the bookends that you kind of threw down. 3 outstanding issues were tree removal, what should be the limit on canopy removal when it's not associated with development, what should be the tree retention requirements associated with development activity, and then what should be the penalty for removing significant trees without a permit. And we did meet with these folks and came to an agreement and have an update and sent you an updated Exhibit A to reflect the language. And it's also shown in the staff memo. So for tree, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here real quick. Where is that? All right, that's not the right one. Why did that? Hang on a second. Share screen. Ah, there it is. It's still not it. What the heck is going on? Share screen. Sorry about that. Usually this is the right one. Screen 2. Proposed amendments. Well, it's odd. Never had this problem before. Proposed amendments. I click on the right one and it gives me the wrong thing. Oh, well, I'll turn to the memo instead because I copied it over in that. Anyways, for tree removal not associated with development activity, under what we're showing, property owners can remove up to 20%, but not to exceed 14,000 square feet. So reduce those thresholds of the existing canopy. And so that would slightly reduce. Sorry, Kelvin, I thought you were trying to show me something. It would slightly reduce the amount of canopy that can be removed from 35 to 20%, but with that cap of 14,000 square feet, or roughly a third of an acre. This option would still allow owners of smaller, less than 3 acre lots to clear around houses and such, but greatly reduces the amount of canopy that can be cleared on larger lots, which are the ones folks seem to be most concerned about. For tree retention associated with development activity, we've developed a simplified sliding scale based on lot size, where in smaller lots can remove a higher percentage, 35% of the canopy, but that percentage decreases as the lot size increases. So this too would allow owners of smaller lots to to adequately use the property, but greatly reduce the amount of canopy that can be cleared on larger lots. Before I move on to the other, I want to see if the commission has any questions about those two. And I'm going to try to get my sharing working because something's not right. Screen 2. Is it showing? What's it showing? It's showing my Outlook thing? I don't want that showing. What's showing? I can't even see. I don't see where it's showing anywhere.
We're seeing it here. It's showing tree removal allowances, and then we can, looks like we're seeing part of Outlook. But we're back to Exhibit A right now.
Okay, that's weird. It's not showing up on my screen. All right, well, I'll assume you can see this then. So as I said, tree removal, so we've changed the language to be 20%, but not to exceed 14,000. Oops, that should be to exceed 14,000 square feet. How does the commission feel about this solution?
Not seeing any hands come up here, Cliff. So when
Okay.
can we-
All right, and then for tree retention associated with development, does that work for the planning commission, having this chart much simplified from the earlier charts we saw? So less than an acre, you can remove up to 35%, or less than 1 to 3 acres, 30%, 3 to less than 10, 20%, and 10 or greater, 15%. Any comments on that? Does that fit within what you guys were looking for?
Commissioner Masseri?
Yeah, the only thing that came to mind, I don't know if there's any lots that would trigger this, but if there was any lots that were small enough that the 35% was less than reasonable use, we need to consider that.
Well, so reasonable use kicks in when you have critical areas. It doesn't really kick in for these tree protection measures, but we would never not allow somebody to have a reasonable house on a lot. Let me see if I can
And
think.
Cliff, there is still the 5,000 square feet or that percent coverage
Yeah,
grant.
yeah. Thank you, Mike. Yeah, so we did keep that 5,000 square feet there. All right. Good catch, Mike. Okay, so that accounts for that. Then when we get into penalties and enforcement, we kept the replacement ratio the same, 3 trees for each one removed, but changed may to shall on the subject of be subject to fines. But more importantly, we put a bunch of standards in here for what types and sizes the trees have to be, that financial guarantees may be required, how they're planted, that they meet best practices, the ISA's best management practices for planting, and that the director considers smaller trees if they can demonstrate it's more suited for the species. Does that seem to fit within what the planning commission was looking for?
Can you hold on? I'm just doing a little reading here, Cliff.
Yep.
So I have a question for you, Cliff.
Sure.
I'm looking at the replacement tree. We talked about big trees and I think that's a good concept, but hard to define. The replacement trees, probably, it seems to me we should have a comment that those replacement trees may not be pruned.
May not be pruned.
May not be pruned, or they shall forever stay at 8 feet.
Uh-huh. Well, let's see.
Or shall not be pruned in a manner that would retard their growth.
I'm trying to figure out where that might fit in.
I'm looking at the height
Yeah.
somewhere in the A, B area. Since we're talking about a minimum height and a minimum diameter.
Well, what I'm thinking is if you wanted something like that, and I don't know if the rest of the commission agrees with you or not, but it'd be another line somewhere around here that says said replacement tree shall not be, I don't know. Replace, let me try to come up with something. Tree. Oh, no. Can't say they can't be pruned because at some size they may have to be pruned.
I guess
That-
Commissioner Masseri, go ahead.
Well, F talks about the installation being in accordance with International
Yeah.
Society of Arboriculture. I'm just wondering if care couldn't be included and, the tree has to be cared for in accordance to reasonable arboriculture guidelines, if they have those.
Yeah, because if we put something in here about them not being able to be pruned, I mean, if you're, I planted a bunch of trees at my house when I first moved in 30 years ago. And I now have this oak tree that's beautiful, but it's 60 feet tall and, shades things very well to the point where our patio is not very warm, even in the summer anymore. And so I was thinking about, looking at it yesterday going, maybe I should prune that somehow. So at some point, trees do need to be pruned.
And I agree with that. I was thinking about, well, the reason I thought up in the AB range is you're talking about conifer trees, or coniferous trees, and those are ones that if you go up and you flip the top off, you can greatly restrict its growth. And it's a lot different on some of the deciduous trees that will take over. Whereas
Yeah.
do coniferous, you stun it, you actually create a weak spot.
Maybe replacement trees should not be topped.
That might be good. And we do have a couple of commissioners that may be.
Yeah, we're all just thinking off the cuff here, so go ahead.
Commissioner Hanson, can you unmute there?
Yes, I can. Well,
Thank you.
I think there's numerous things you could do to a tree. You could girdle it, you could cut it down. So it seems like what we want is that those trees to be cared for and to obtain their natural function and size. And hopefully they won't plant it where it's going to shade their house. But that's what we're after is restoring that canopy.
All right.
So somehow in a positive way, we could say what our expectations are for those trees that are being planted. And another kettle of worms is offsite mitigation. Maybe plant trees on somebody else's property, but that's another topic.
Yeah, and the Million Tree Project guys suggested the council set up some sort of fund and that people could pay into that. I guess we were a little hesitant to propose something, to the planning commission that would require the council to set up a whole new funding mechanism for things. Though they may be open to it. It just doesn't seem that through a code amendment, that's the proper way to get to them and ask them.
We want them watered too, right? We don't want them just planting them. In this summer, they probably need to water them the first summer through to make them these bigger trees. So maybe that's in the silvicultural management practices.
Maybe installation and maintenance of required. Let's try this. Maintenance and care. Maintenance. Care.
Well, long-term health and survival does seem to indicate that they will keep growing.
Right. Yeah. Kelvin, does that get to your point there? We just include maintenance.
Agree with it. I'm thinking in terms of if I am just a regular person who's never been involved in planning, what that will say to them, that because we really want someone that doesn't normally read the code, but you say, here's the section to read, that they understand that they can't go top the tree. And you can't say I cared for it by cutting the top off. I think something about topping rather than pruning maybe is the best thing to say. And because thinking about the conifer trees, the topping really stunts them or has a propensity to greatly stunt them. That might do it. And Commissioner Lund, I want to get to you here just a moment. Okay, Commissioner Lund, go ahead.
Yeah, I have some clarifying questions for staff on really what in their mind kind of E means. Financial guarantees for replacement trees may be required. And again, what would be the funding mechanism, or what does that look like? And then for F, as we're refining, is there an enforcement? Is there somebody that comes and checks or verifies? How do we verify that this has been done?
So financial guarantees or financial sureties usually take the form of bonds or an account set up in a bank that we have access to, and it has to stay there for X number of years. We do that for all kinds of improvements that need to be monitored and maintained long term.
Okay.
In terms of
thanks, Cliff. Yeah.
And then in terms of enforcement, that would primarily be Mike and Belinda. I doubt it would be a high priority for them, but if somebody were to lodge a complaint, either they or code enforcement people would get involved.
Commissioner Hanson, go ahead.
Well, to make that surety work, perhaps we should say will be rather than may be, because when we say may, the expectation is probably not. So are you going to look at a certain landowner and say, we don't trust you, so we're going to expect surety from you, but the other guy we're not going to? It seems like just make it straightforward.
It's possible. I guess there are, some people are going to take care of trees and others you're not so sure of.
Well, the ones that you have to penalize in the first place are in the lower percentile in responsibility, perhaps.
Yeah. All right, well, so that's a word I think the planning commission should all weigh in on.
Well, when we're done with the discussion, I'll make that as an amendment. How about that?
Yeah, that'd probably work best because that has some ramifications to it, some cost ramifications for folks.
Let's hold with that thought for a moment. Commissioner Lund, I see your hand went down. Are you fine with that or did you speak?
Yeah, especially if Jim's going to bring that forward as a motion, but I support that line of thinking.
Commissioner Masseri.
Yeah, I didn't get my hand up quick enough when we were back on F. One thought would be to have a handout that's given to people for installation and care when they're required to do this. Pretty simple thing that might help.
Yeah. And we do have lots of handouts here.
Oops.
Commissioner Hanson.
Yes, on F, I was also thinking we could tag on after topping or otherwise inhibited from natural growth. 'Cause
Yeah, that
you could do root pruning too to keep it from growing up.
And while there are no hands up, I actually have to tell the story where I learned about the topping. I, at one time in my life, owned a house on 2 acres and it had a main power transmission line going by it. And before my house was built, I'll say the public utility that owned it came in with a boom truck, reached way out of the property and topped 40 conifer trees. And then my house was built, but along the way, these trees grew up. And after I had been in the house for a number of years, that same utility district came along and said, all those trees need to come out of this property because they're all weak because somebody topped them. And they had a list of 40 and they started threatening me with fines. And then fortunately, I had someone from the utility district come out that had, let's say, a little more solid head on his shoulders, and he admitted that it was them that topped it and that it would wreck the whole atmosphere of the property if they took all these trees out. And he told me 2 that were the closest. If we could do those, that would be great. And that's when I learned about what tree topping does on conifers.
I had the same thing. They weren't conifers, but our PUD came out and chopped down a bunch of trees on the side of my slope. You know, they were holding the soil in and everything. And I filed a claim and won that.
All right. Commissioner Hanson, what are you wishing to speak?
Just one small word, I think, in F to insert in the best management practices, not limited to, maybe nitpicking, but I would put spacing, because we've seen people plant trees to make hedges, and I don't think that is, I know that's not the intent. So I think each type of tree has an appropriate spacing that will help restore the canopy. So I don't know if I'm not super adamant on that one, but it just seems like just to make sure someone doesn't go, oh, I have to plant 10 trees. I think I'll make a hedge.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. I also wanted to point out that Commissioner Hanson sent me an email and then asked that I forward it to you, suggesting that we add allowances for greater tree canopy removal. And I've added this in. This is not in your Exhibit A. I just put it in here today so you can see what it looks like. So allow for greater tree canopy removal for what we've talked about before, fire-wise management and pest and disease outbreaks. So on a case-by-case basis, additional canopy may be removed for those 2 things. So I don't know what the commission feels about that, but
That was me? I don't think so.
Well, you forwarded Alex's email, I think, and said
Okay,
you were
gotcha.
going to raise the issue.
And
So I thought I'd just get to it and show you how it might work. So how does the commission feel about these two paragraphs here? Should they remain or not?
Not seeing any hands or any indications.
Okay,
Can we pause just for a moment? We have an attendee with his hand up that, sorry, let's go to Kimberly Lund first and then we'll try to go to the attendee.
That's fine. Let's let the attendees speak. I'm in favor of that. I'll withhold comment till after they've spoken.
Okay, Michael, would you give us some input here on, we had a couple proposals and I saw your hand go up and
Yes, I'd be happy to. For the record, I'm Michael Fear, the Executive Director of Walk a Million Trees Project. As you know from Cliff's memo and statement, we've been working together with Alex Harris from Resources and with Cliff and Mike to develop, what you have before you now. The goal was, well, and before I say anything else, I just want to say I'm here to answer any questions you may have about any of these revisions or any of these additional tweaks that you've been talking about tonight. Overall, the goal was to do in a fair, equitable way, a way to save the mature trees in our, in the overlays watersheds over the coming years that would needlessly be cut by landowners under the current rules, and to accomplish that in a painless way that overstretched, under-resourced county staff could implement. So all in all, we feel satisfied with what's before you. And of course, we helped develop that together with everyone else that was involved. But I'm here to answer any questions about any of the things that's been talked about tonight or anything else. Thank you.
all right, thank you. Commissioner Lund?
Well, to address Cliff's question about the Firewise management and pest and disease outbreaks, I'm in favor of leaving them in. I mean, if someone goes to the trouble to work with those professionals to get that additional assessment, I think they should be able to act on it.
Any other feedback from commissioners on that section? Commissioner Hanson?
to be a curmudgeon, but I guess I am. I'm not super adamant in opposing these, but I'm a little reticent because I have a hard time seeing a live healthy tree being a fire danger, whereas all the branches that the landowners left lying on the ground to pile up around the tree, I would consider the fire danger. I suppose a tree that has died due to an outbreak certainly should be removed. So I can, that one I don't have a problem with, but the fire danger, I used to work in fire as a firefighter in forest fire, and fuel control is all about the dead wood, not about the live wood.
I appreciate that, Doug. So Cliff, a question I have then is, do you have an idea of what DNR would be looking at?
Or Firewise management?
Yes.
Yeah, what I've heard is that the best practices for that say to remove all trees within, I think it is 15 feet of structures. So you don't have branches hanging over your house, dropping needles and leaves and things like that.
I'm familiar with it a little bit in Eastern Washington. My brother is over there. He always uses the term Firewise. But I appreciate what Commissioner Hanson had to say.
Yeah, I think the issue on that is that, if you have a lot where trees are actually right up against your house, the fire professionals say you should probably get rid of those.
Yeah, then you won't have to get gutter guards either.
Right. So with that, that's all I have to present to you. I hope that what we put together as a team has done what you wanted it to do.
All right, thank you, Clint. Commissioners, what would you like to do? I'm sorry, Commissioner Masseri, go ahead.
I have a question on the size of the replacement trees.
Yeah, let me. Where was it? Here. So replacement conifer trees 8 feet in height and deciduous trees 2.5 inches DBH.
Yeah, I was just curious how those specific sizes were determined. The 8 feet versus 7 or 9 feet, and 2.5 versus 2 or 3. I think last time we discussed we were 2 inches. So I was just curious how those specific numbers came.
I think that Michael Freer had suggested those as kind of standard trees that you can actually get and have transplanted to your house without major equipment. I see his hand is raised. He may be able to tell you how he got those numbers.
Michael, would you go ahead and answer that question, how you came up with those numbers?
Yeah, thank you. Well, the truth is that different agencies and municipalities around Washington all have variable, minimum standards for those. Some say 6, some say 8, some say 1.5 inches, some say 2 or 2.5. So there's no magic bullet there, really. The main idea is to ensure that the replacement trees are well beyond their initial seedling years, where they're most prone to deer impacts or to excessive rainfall or flooding or hot summer, ultra hot summer impacts that can kill them off. And so as they get to this order of magnitude of size for conifers, that's when they're at that point where they're kind of hardy enough that they can go beyond that. And so the context here, as the rules are written, is that this is on-site tree replacement by people that may not be, pros to taking care of a tree like that. So if we start off with a tree that's mature enough, yet still relatively young and easily transportable and transplantable, then that can hopefully account for that to at least some degree, so that the tree more or less kind of rides the rest of the way of its growth on its own without too much intervention needed by the landowner. Now, if we're talking about the possibility of off-site trees, which is a whole nother thing that that some of you have inquired about, then that could be smaller specimens, that commonly reforestation in a watershed would be 2-year-old seedlings that are 15 inches high and things of that sort, which are readily available. But here in this context, as a mandated replacement tree thing, the idea is to do something more mature yet still available.
Commissioner Masseri.
I have a follow-up for Michael. Sounds like that our proposal is potentially on the higher end of what jurisdictions are doing for the height and or diameter. Is there any evidence for that we're at our threshold that we're at will give us a substantially higher percentage of survivability? When you go from 6 to 8 and from 1.5 to 2.5, obviously there'll be a cost increase. So it'd be nice to make sure that it's also, gonna increase the likelihood a fair bit of the tree surviving. If there wasn't much benefit to it, then maybe it doesn't add that much. So I'm just curious if there's any documented evidence that that's threshold.
Yeah, I mean, generally, the bigger and older the tree, the more likely it will survive better. But that said, there's probably not any science I could point to that would make the direct comparison between, say, 6 foot tall versus 8 foot tall or that kind of thing. The main thing is to get beyond, at least 4 or 5 feet, to get beyond that kind of level, which is usually about the first 6 years or so of growth, depending on the conifer of what that might be. Conifers tend to, well, it depends on the species, but some start out slow in their growth and some start out fast and then slow down. So it just all depends on which native conifer we're talking about.
Commissioner Hanson.
Just a FYI, we're talking about difference of height of a foot or two. It's not too significant. What's significant is the size of the root ball and the amount of intact roots that go into the ground. So, and that is not easy to determine. So I tend to think that the actual height isn't that important, but it will tend to have a certain size customary root ball that hopefully will be adequate.
Commissioner
Would it make sense to then list them under box size or a way that you would commonly purchase a tree? I know I discussed this with Michael, so if you have a comment, I'd like to hear it.
Go ahead, Michael.
Yeah. In a lot of ways, the root mass can be indicative of the kind of a size equivalent kind of standard. The problem is that different conifers have, and other trees, other major trees, some are more horizontal oriented in the root ball, and some are more deeper oriented in the way they have a tap root. And so there's no real uniformity among that you could use as a gauge. So that's why, none of the other agencies or municipalities use a root ball or gallon size or things of that sort as a way to, be the measuring stick, so to speak, for those kind of trees. There's really no perfect answer. I think that, what we have here in terms of the concept of height and or diameter at breast height, that's pretty much the most common way that it's addressed. But there, again, there's no perfect answer. There's so enough said.
So commissioners, what would you like to do?
Are we ready to pass this on to the council? Is that the next step? I guess I'm asking.
Sure, that's a valid question. So where we're at right now is that there may be questions about some of the lines in here. Cliff has given us a fair amount of information. There could be questions about that, but beyond that, if there aren't questions about that, it would be, and I do see we have a hand up, it would be appropriate to send it or not send it or modify it. But Commissioner Lund, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm dialing in on my phone tonight, so I have like a microfiche screen situation, but I'm wondering if Commissioner Hanson could make an amendment from the may to the shall or will, and we could have some conversation about that as a commission. And then otherwise, I feel like if we can kind of, that's my one thing that I'd like to think through. Otherwise, I'm feeling like we're getting very close.
Thank you. Is there discussion about that? We had some earlier. May or shall. So. Oh, there we go. Commissioner Hanson.
If the rest of the commissioners are happy to move on from the discussion phase and are ready to accept the new wording in yellow with the underlines, I'd be ready to make a motion regarding the may versus shall, but I just don't want to go over boundaries. Maybe you could suggest how we might want to proceed in that regard, if we need a preliminary motion or if we're ready to just start our little amendments.
Well, Commissioner Hanson, I'm gonna, I'll say this way, I don't know that I need to say it this way, but I'll say I'm gonna rule that let's go ahead and talk about it. You could make the motion, but let's go ahead and talk about it. I know it came up earlier.
Okay, I'll move in under E that may be replaced by shall.
And I would second that.
We have a motion and a second to replace may with the word shall on 10 section E. Right, and Commissioner Lund, would you like to speak to that?
Yeah, thank you. The reason why this is appealing to me, and I'm looking forward to the discussion about it, is because I feel like I'm not sure who the arbiter of the may is and in what situation or what the criteria is for if we're deeming someone who may be a risk for poorly planting replacement trees. I mean, everyone that's falling into this category has either intentionally or unintentionally, but they've chopped down a tree that they shouldn't have. And so how do we from there decide, okay, now, someone on staff has to make a judgment call on whether they're putting money in or not. And to me, that seems a bit of an equity issue. And so I'm in favor, because I see it almost more as a deterrent, that if we have it as shall, that people are thinking twice. It's like if you are digging and you cut a cable on your property, you will be fined. And so in this way, you are putting money in reserves to ensure that you're making reparations for the trees being removed.
Assistant Planning Director Roberge would like to make a couple observations. So go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, maybe I can just shed a little light on. So these would all be enforcement issues, right? So these would go through code enforcement, generally speaking, right? There may be other ways that they come up. These can be large and these can be small. And the concern that I have is that if this becomes a shell, that we're requiring assignment of funds or bond on every single one. And like I said, these can be large, these can be small. This might be a single tree or a couple of trees that all of a sudden we need to have someone have an assignment of funds to monitor that they may have done on purpose or they may have done by accident. The may gives us the option, if we think there's a risk there, to require an assignment of funds. They would be required to maintain those. That would be part of our enforcement case, would be that they replace those trees and maintain them. The assignment of funds just adds another layer for us to one, require, monitor, and then release at some point in time. So it adds a lot more layers from us from the staff perspective on the shell. The may, I would interpret that when we had those that were, we have from time to time recurrent customers in code enforcement. And so those types of situations would be one where we definitely would want to see an assignment of funds to make sure that something stayed. Anyway, just a little, hopefully, insight into when you ask who would be looking at that, that would be through our enforcement process. Generally.
Thank you. That was a helpful comment.
So, Commissioner London, do you have more comment? I think we're taking care of that. So a question I have then is, let's just go with, I'm not saying go with the shall. Well, let's assume that we have shall, I'm sorry, let's assume we have may. What is the monitoring on it? And are we back to code enforcement, or, you know, let's say that somebody takes something down, puts a replacement in. Who monitors it if there is no financial guarantees? Who monitors it?
Is that to me?
Yeah, I'll ask you, Steve. That would be great.
Yeah. So the answer is it depends. If there's critical areas involved, that's a different story. So we're talking about trees outside of critical areas. So the other thing we found in enforcement cases is that we operate generally on a complaint basis. And so what we find is that probably the person who complained the first time, if something goes away, complains the second time. We found that people are very effective at that. So we generally would not monitor that. Again, just as a staffing, it's a resource kind of a thing. If it's not a critical area, we generally wouldn't have a monitoring requirement.
And so let's say that it's a shall, and so there is a financial guarantee. Who monitors it? What's the difference?
That's something we have to figure out.
And
If we did this with all of them. And now if it's associated with a development, that's a different story, but if this is just unfortunate.
and I Commissioner Lund, maybe you can, I don't want to try and guess what you were thinking, but I do think the shall is probably guarantees a little more compliance with a replacement tree remaining. If you want to weigh in on that, Commissioner Lund, I appreciate your thoughts. Otherwise,
Well, yeah, I agree. It sounds like a little more security. I'm interested in hearing if there's any other commissioners that want to speak to this.
Commissioner Hanson, go ahead.
I'm also interested in what others have to say rather than listening to myself talk all the time. But one thing I would think about in that escrow fund would be that perhaps it could be adequate to pay for professional monitoring. We have folks in the community who would be adequate to do that monitoring once or twice a year. So it wouldn't be incumbent upon overworked county staff to take care of that function.
Commissioner Jefferson, go ahead.
I just want to agree with Commissioner Lund, and I want to thank staff. I meant to do that first for all the work, because I know this is a lot of work. I probably can't imagine how much work, but I do believe it would leave us more vulnerable if we left it at May. And although I do understand good reasoning at leaving it at May, I still think we're just way too vulnerable at leaving it at May. That's just my thoughts. Thank you.
And Mike, you've had your hand up. We go ahead and give us your thoughts.
Sure. So one thing I want to clarify, and Cliff, I think you're still in control. Is this penalties and enforcement associated with tree removal, associated with development?
Yes.
Okay. So I will say, usually I
Well,
100%.
it's copied into both
Oh, okay.
sections though, so
Okay,
it's in both.
Okay. Well, I will say for the tree removal associated with development, we do have, usually we require those financial guarantees in case the person walks away and we would need to use that money to actually do the planting ourselves, which I will say I've never been party to, but that's the idea. When it comes to building, we have what I've found to be much better ways of gaining compliance, mainly holding inspections. Like you can't get your sheathing inspection, or you can't get your final occupancy inspection. So there are other ways to gain compliance that oftentimes are more motivational for builders. So that's one reason why it might be may, although usually I agree. I would rather always generally have shall rather than may, because I don't want it to just be me deciding, you know, based on any factors they feel that day, right? But in the case of building, I think that there is a reason for it to be may, because we have other ways to go about getting compliance, and it's much more efficient, I guess. That's my only comment.
Mike, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So, and maybe Cliff, perhaps you have knowledge of this, but we talk about putting a financial guarantee. What are we talking about? Does anyone have a dollar amount that we're talking about?
So that's something else that if it was going to be shall, we'd have to hammer out as well, because does it mean labor? Does it mean materials? Does it mean labor and materials? Does it mean monitoring? You know, saying shall in just that one sentence probably isn't enough, because then what guidance do we have to give somebody to say, you have to put X amount of money in an assignment of savings account?
Usually it's enough money to cover what needs to be done to fix the problem.
And usually in a critical areas situation, like with a mitigation report or a monitoring report, we'd have qualified consultants provide the cost of labor and materials plus, I think, 125% of that number. So it's usually from a third party that figures that number out as part of a review process, generally not part of the enforcement process, I admit. So it's not really the same, but.
Commissioner Masseri.
I'd like to get staff's opinion on any liability of leaving it as may, of somebody claiming discriminatory practices or what, saying they were singled out.
I would leave that for the prosecuting attorney staff that's not here. They don't like us to talk. I'll tell you what we tell our the public when they ask us about liability question is that the prosecuting attorney's office does not like us to talk about liability.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of things that are mays, right? And so, and especially if it's like an enforcement situation, there is some discretion that can be used. So that just gives us that ability to, if we think it's necessary. But yeah, we don't want to talk about liability, but we have discretion, and so we try to use that. Usually in a situation like that, if we saw something happening on a regular basis, we might want to write up some kind of policy on it to kind of spell out when and how type of a thing to clarify it internally at least.
So I'd like to speak to it. I have concerns with shall, but I have probably more concerns with may, and I am looking or thinking of the Homestead condo project on right in front of Leisure Park in Birch Bay, where they were required to leave approximately 50 trees, and most of those 50 are down. They were required to put in 6 replacement trees. The 6 replacement trees went in. They were about 6 feet tall. All of those are gone. Those were just cut off at the base a couple of years later. And that's all on there's no shall, there's no monitoring. And one of the things they did, in fact, that made it hard for the county to monitor is they got an address change by about 10 digits. So I can't remember the address, but instead of it being, say, a 7,800, they went to a 7,810. And every time they would come in for permission to cut trees, Whatcom County would have no record of that address having any restrictions. So they would just take the trees out that the hearing examiner required to remain. So I lean toward the shall because I watched what happened with the May. And once they're down, well, we gave them permission. Yeah, it was the wrong address, but we gave permission. We can't do anything about it now. So I watched a lot of trees come down. And it bothers me. And I am open to somebody having a solution to it.
So I guess my question then would be, if the commission moves towards shall, at what point would that be released? Because normally, like when we're dealing with development, that's released after usually somewhere between 3 to 5 years once there's establishment of that. Because those bonds are in place to make sure that it's going to grow. This bond, I think, is being, or this surety is being placed for the purpose of making sure that it's there long term. So what's that term that's going to be? It's going to hold part of that in place. Sorry, I don't mean to. It's kind of a good question.
Cliff?
Yes, sir.
Do you have any answers for that, staff?
I couldn't hear you. What?
Do you have any answers to that question?
I could not hear Steve very well.
All right.
If that question was to me.
Do you have solutions to resolve this?
Oh, yeah, take a vote.
Commissioner Lund?
I also couldn't hear Steve very well. Did he say it's common to have sureties for 3 to 5 years? Is that a time frame that he mentioned?
Yeah, sorry. Can you hear me? Can you hear me better now? Sorry.
Yes.
I can, yeah.
Yeah, so that is a common time frame for sureties, and that was really kind of a question back. What would be the time frame for this if the commission moves to a shell? How long would we hold those? Make sure those funds were in place.
Commissioner Masseri?
Well, Steve, you quantified that a little bit more, that was for establishment typically because it was for mitigation or plantings of some kind, but this was on a longer scale to make sure the tree survived. And so that was part of your comment, that is it being held for a longer duration than something like that?
I'm wondering if Michael might be able to weigh in on, from his perspective, what would be reasonable to try and make an assessment of the tree's establishment.
Go ahead, Michael.
Thanks. Well, what I've been hearing in the various comments is a couple of things. One is that, the question of whether may versus shall is applicable in the situation where it might be a homeowner that, that just, either inadvertently or for whatever reason removed 1 or 2 trees and someone complained, versus a larger situation where someone say, clear cut a 5-acre lot, for their home or something, way beyond the percentages we're specifying in this in the new regulations. And so I'm wondering if the financial guarantee thing might have, in terms of the shall, if shall is included, maybe that shall applies to over a certain number of replacement trees, like over, say, more than 1 dozen replacement trees, and then a shall kicks in. I don't know. That's the only thought I had on that, to maybe simplify the rules about that. But in terms of the tree itself, the care piece, you know, so I get reports at times from different landowners that say, in fact, this was one in the Lake Wacom watershed, where they were required to plant replacement trees, and so they did. It was, I think, it was a 2-unit housing development over in the Geneva area, and they apparently planted the replacement trees, and then intentionally kind of planted them in the wrong spots, and then knocked them out later. And since there was no follow through or monitoring, that just nothing more happened. So, I guess what needs to happen if there was to be more of a financial guarantee is to have something that's that gets, there's always going to be an opening for somebody to work around that rule. If you say 3 to 5 years or that kind of thing. But in terms of the tree's health itself, the first couple of years after it's transplanted are the most critical. So, so I guess that's all I have to offer in that.
So 3 or 5 years in your assessment would be adequate to
if we're talking about a tree that's starting out at something like 8 foot height, a conifer, and then there's a financial guarantee for 3 to 5 years, that would get it well beyond that transitional phase of adequately adapting to its new site location and things of that sort. A certain number of trees, no matter how well they're planted, don't succeed, especially when they're smaller, not so much the bigger ones. So it's inevitable there could be an occasional die-off, even with the best of intentions. But 3 to 5 years, and certainly at least the first year or two, would be kind of the critical threshold in terms of the tree successfully adapting to its new location.
Thank you. Commissioner Masseri?
Yeah, so if there's a financial guarantee, and let's say somebody tries their best, but they planted 3 trees and they still lose 1, are they going to be continually then hit to keep replanting and trying to get these trees to go, or do they just say, okay, take my financial guarantee for that tree, and I'm off the hook? I do want to assume that trees may die with somebody with the best intentions, because I've planted a lot of trees and wanted them to survive, and they don't.
Mike, go ahead.
There is also, we have had some difficulty with transfer of those financial guarantees, especially if, say, a builder cuts down a tree that they weren't supposed to in their building. And we're talking about monitoring periods of 3 to 5 years. He's going to sell that house. And then that fee is still in his name, but he or she might not have any, right? They're not the property owner anymore. So that poses another set of difficulties. And I don't know if I'm forming complete thoughts, but I that's just something that popped up in my mind. The issues that we've had before with critical areas, assignment of savings, which is a financial guarantee. And then just to go back to the 3 to 5 years, the critical areas ordinance says monitoring for 3 to 5 years, and that's usually monitoring for installation of ground covers, shrubs, and trees. And so, if that's kind of equivalent, the 3 to 5 years should be adequate to see if trees are surviving or not. But
Commissioner Lund?
Well, I'm wondering about the point about the transfer piece. If we set it at 2 years, which is less than we've been discussing, but might be in a window before most transfers would be taking place potentially. especially if it's from homeowner to homeowner. For capital gains purposes, people typically hold on for around that time frame. And then if we did that assessment at 2 years, and it's a one-time assessment. If there had been die-off, we could request a replacement, the 2-year check-in, and then to answer Commissioner Mosseri's concern, and then that's it. Like, if you made a go of it, some of them died, you're going to make a good faith effort to replace those, and then that's the end of it. We can't just keep it going ad infinitum.
Commissioner Hanson, go ahead. Need to unmute Commissioner Hanson.
He's still talking.
There we go. Remember, these are penalties, not fees or not permit requirements. So if they end up being slightly punitive, that might be okay. The point that Mike made about how are we going to determine how much this is going to cost? That point would be cogent under any circus, either under may or under shall. So that point doesn't really speak to whether it should be may or shall. I personally, I don't see what would be a problem if it's 3 to 5 years, if you have to have a lien on or an attachment on the title. Remember, this is a penalty. This isn't a permit condition. And there should be enough. And we want to think about adaptive management, which is the sister of monitoring. When have money in there, so when the tree dies, money can come out of that fund to replant that tree and hopefully get it to live.
Commissioner Mosseri.
Well, to Commissioner Hanson's point, in reality, all of these things we've discussed are going to have to be determined by somebody at some point, whether or not it's may or shall. So maybe we don't need to even hash out all those details if staff's already doing that on the development side, on the mitigation side. I don't know that we need to reinvent all that for this. We could just decide may or shall, and they will do what they're already doing.
All right, and then Alexander is one of our attendees. Alexander, would you go ahead and talk to us?
Hey, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
I just wanted to weigh in with a potential suggestion. First, for the record, my name is Alexander Harris. I work with Resources as the Land and Water Policy Manager. I really appreciate all the nuance you are all going into. I wanted to make a suggestion that potentially the homeowner incentive program, HIP, could be, it could potentially be helpful in aiding landowners reforest their land. I know there is a need for some kind of penalty here, but really the goal is to make sure trees are put back in the right place and maintained for those first 5 years. Does anyone have insight in Whatcom Conservation District and or the HIP program could facilitate that replanting and maintenance, either through consultation or through actual, facilitating the actual work itself?
I'm trying to think. I think the HIP program is the city of Bellingham's program.
It's the county too. I'm familiar with it.
We pay into it.
No, we actually have public works staff that works with the conservation district and reviews projects, HIP projects. That's probably a question that's good above my pay grade, but the HIP program is meant for retrofits specifically, and it is specifically supposed to provide money and resources to people to retrofit their properties. So if we're talking about spending county money and resources to replant properties where somebody knowingly cut down trees they weren't supposed to. That seems questionable.
Steve Roberts, go ahead.
Sorry, I just want to clarify. I've heard a couple of people say penalties. We've been talking about item E, which is a financial guarantee, which is not, I want to make sure that's not a penalty. That's a financial guarantee. Penalties is a different item. I just want to clarify. I think that's what we're talking about.
Correct. Appreciate that. Is there any more discussion on this? If there's no more discussion, I want to make sure everybody has a chance to speak. There's no more discussion. Gabby, would you call the roll, please, on this motion?
Okay. So.
It would be, the motion is to change under section 10 penalties and enforcement, and it's section E, financial guarantees for replacement trees, changing the may to shall be required.
Commissioner Van Dalen,
Yes.
Commissioner Hanson,
Yes.
Commissioner Jefferson,
Yes.
Commissioner Lund,
Yes.
Commissioner Masseri,
No.
Commissioner Bart.
Yes.
That is 5 yeses, 1 no. That carries.
Is there more discussion on?
Just want to make sure we have a quorum.
We do 5 is our quorum.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we're to the main, back to the main topic. The watershed overlay district amendments. Do we have more discussion? I'm going to leave it open here for a little bit if there's more discussion. But otherwise, we need to decide whether we're recommending it to the council or not recommending. Someone have a motion to recommend it or to not recommend it? Commissioner Hanson.
I'd recommend this to be forwarded to council as amended. And if there's findings, and with the findings of fact.
I'll second.
Thank you. Is there discussion on the motion? The motion is to send it to council with a recommendation. And along with the findings of fact. Is there more discussion on this? Any more discussion? Tammy, would you call the roll, please?
Commissioner Hanson,
Yes.
Commissioner Jefferson,
Yes.
Commissioner Lund,
Yes.
Commissioner Masseri,
Yes.
Commissioner Van Dalen,
Yes.
Commissioner Bart.
Yes.
That is 6 yeses, that carries.
And we have any other business? Any new business? No new business. I don't see any hands up. Should we go home? All right, the meeting is adjourned.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all. Good job.
Thank you.